if we go forward now, so I said I think that there were two reactions if you remember, I began with the proposition that the fundamental problem was that we slithered in a very, very British fashion. But there were the two things. There was the decision essentially to try to shut people up, which of course has become much more sophisticated, and I imagine at some point we'll go on and talk about its latest very alarming manifestations. But there was a serious attempt, and I think we need to acknowledge its seriousness. I think it was profoundly misconceived, but there was a serious attempt, as there was in most things, in the Blair years, that's from 1997 onwards to 2010, to rethink the whole question of British identity. And it was a serious attempt, as indeed I've argued there was an attempt, and a very successful one, although the consequences, in my view, are terrible, to reinvent the entire British state. What I talk about, the slow burn French Revolution or Blairite Revolution of those years. But let's just look and pull apart a little bit this question of the creation of a British identity. It seems to me that it took one particular. You can see it coming in various stages, but essentially, again, you'll forgive me if I'm a very old and senile man, so you'll forgive me if I chatter about my childhood. When I was a boy,
enjoy it.
When I was a boy, and I still got my first passport, which I had for that trip abroad when I was an 11-year-old schoolboy, and my parents, in retrospect, must have sacrificed enormously to let me go on that school trip. I am simply a subject of the crown. That's what I am. And in other words, that we had, remember, Britain is not a nation state. This is the most important thing one has to say to people. I do not remember anybody describing us as British. The only things that were British were horrific nationalised industries. So you had British Gas and you had British Rail, and indeed you still had just the British Empire. But you didn't call yourself British. I mean, I'm always, and still less Briton, when I see the term Britons. I'm reminded of the remark that Disraeli is supposed to have made when some vulgarian in the House of Commons, made an anti-Semitic remark, and he replied, when your British ancestors were naked and daubed in woad, mine were priests in the temple of Solomon, and that it's Briton are the kind of people that Julius Caesar met. And what you were British was simply an identity abroad, like the empire. You were English, Scots, Welsh, Irish at home. The first football matches, and still intensely played, between England and Scotland, the first internationals. So there was what I would call always being anybody in the United Kingdom had a hyphenated identity. You were, if you remember, there was already, when I was a boy, when I was a young man, there were the very beginnings of Scottish nationalism. When the Queen was crowned in 1953, there was an immense spate of blowing up post boxes in Scotland because, of course, they had the royal cipher E2R. Well, there hadn't been a Queen Elizabeth I of Scotland. So, but Scots who were loyal Unionist Scots had a hyphenated identity, that you were Scottish in terms of your accent, your religion, usually, your education and so on, unless you were the very high elite, in which case you'd been to a high English public school. But in terms of your politics and your social alignment and whatever, you were Anglo-Scot. You see what I mean? There was, because what within all that, within those three cultures, there was a very sharp division. You had Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and particularly Scotland, which had all the elements of a typical continental nationalism: national music, the bagpipe; national dress, the kilt; a national poet, Burns. The English don't have those things. Well, we have got Shakespeare, but we don't have a national dress. Well, actually, we do. It's a Savile Row suit, but that's a long and difficult question. So, but what we gave, England supplied the dominant political and social culture. Now, what was determined to happen under and it's Gordon Brown much more than Tony Blair was, that there's an attempt at eradicating all of that. Or eradicating the essential core of that. Devolution, of course, led to an extreme encouragement of Scottishness, Welshness, Irishness, and whatever. Intensely developed with the concessions to nationalism, though, of course, the setting up of the Scottish Parliament at the behest of Donald Dewar was supposedly to kill Scottish nationalism. Of course, as any sensible person knew, it simply provided a theatre for it. But the thing that was under consistent attack in the Blair years was the idea of Englishness. And instead, which had been, the cultural cement of all of that, and instead you tried to substitute for that historic, subtle culture of self-government, of self-restraint, of irony, of good manners, you tried to substitute a crude, superimposed British identity in which, remember, we were able to find only two British values: tolerance and diversity. Now, that, of course, is a farce, isn't it? It's always been a farce. Isn't it true? I mean, the idea that you can have a nation built around tolerance and diversity...
No, it's bonkers.
It's bonkers. It turns identity simply into a flag of convenience. Anybody can fly it.
And I also think that in some ways, I'd find these values, tolerance and diversity, diametrically opposed to one another in any case. I think that in some ways our rising diversity, especially religious diversity, has led to various forms of intolerance. I'll give you an example. For example,
by definition,
yeah, and I think that a bit. I'm someone, and I'm hoping we can just talk about this later on. I take great pride in my Bengali ancestry and indeed my Islamic faith, but I'd be the first one to admit that, especially more segregated elements of the Muslim population, anti-Semitism is rife. Discrimination against sexual minorities is part and parcel, if truth be told. So I think that the real problem we had is that we had these set of British values. They're hugely vague and nebulous, and in some cases they're actually in conflict with one another. You possibly can't. It can't be the basis for a cohesive national society, can it?